Hey guys, this is Anthony Morganti from anthonymorganti.com. In this video, we're going to take a look at all the different menu settings in a Fujifilm XPro2. Now we're just going to jump right into it, and the first category are the image quality settings. And right at the top we have image size. Now this is pertinent to if you're shooting JPEG in camera. And you could change it from the default 3:2 ratio to a 16:9 or a 1:1. Or a lower quality, in this case a medium quality, 3:2, 16:9, 1:1, or a small image, a 3:2, 16:9. Now most of us want the best quality possible, so we'd have that on L, and we want to stick with the 3:2 ratio usually, so we'll stay with 3:2. Now again, if you're shooting raw images only, then this wouldn't be pertinent because the raw image is a 3:2 ratio, and it saves all the data, so the L, M, and S don't matter for a raw image. Image quality, this is where we could tell it to shoot either a fine JPEG, which is the best quality JPEG, a normal JPEG, which is not quite as good quality as a fine JPEG, a fine JPEG with a RAW file, which is what I have it set to right now, a normal JPEG with a RAW file, or a RAW file all by itself. Now typically I just shoot RAW files all by themselves, but for the purpose of this demonstration I have it set to fine and RAW, because if I had it set to RAW only, some of these JPEG adjustments would be grayed out and I wouldn't be able to show them to you. Now when you are shooting RAW, how do you want to save the RAW file? Do you want to save it as an uncompressed file? It will take up more space on your SD card and on your computer, or do you want to compress it in a lossless format? I prefer to compress mine in a lossless format. No data is lost and no image quality is compromised. So that's why I use lossless compressed. Next is film simulation mode. Now this will only be applied to the JPEG. If you shoot RAW, this will not be applied to the RAW file, but they will be available to you when you post-process your RAW file in whatever software you use for the post-processing. If you use Lightroom, all these film simulation modes will be available under the camera calibration tab. There'll be a drop down there and you could pick Provia Standard, Velvia Vivid, Astia Soft, and so on. Now again, if you're shooting JPEG in camera, you could set what you want here, and then it will be burnt into your JPEG, that type of film simulation mode. Grain effect, do you want to add a bit of grain to your JPEG image? Again, you could pick weak or strong. Again, that does not affect your raw image at all. It's only for JPEG. Dynamic range, I have mine set to auto, and what dynamic range is, how much does the camera basically see into the darkest areas of the scene and into the lightest areas in the scene. Usually you would like as much dynamic range as possible. Now you can see I had mine set to auto, and then there's 100, and then the 200 and the 400 are grayed out. That's because I have my ISO set to 200. If I set my ISO to 400, then 200% becomes available. And if I set my ISO to 800, then the 400% becomes available. Now again, this is only for JPEG shooting. When you shoot RAW, you're saving all the data from the scene into a file. So this is just what the camera will do to your JPEG image. It will give you either limited dynamic range or as much dynamic range as possible. The next is the white balance. You could come in with custom settings, or you could set it to auto, let the camera determine the light in the scene and what color temperature that light is. Or you could come in and you could dial in very specific types of light. The color temperature, you could put in a Kelvin value, or you could just dial in like shade or fluorescent lighting and incandescent lighting and things like that. The Fujifilm auto setting works very well. The camera really does recognize the color temperature of the light and does a really nice job. When you might want to choose a different setting, usually is for some creative effects. Sometimes if you have some mixed lighting, you have windows with sunlight coming in, but you have fluorescent lights in the building and things like that. Highlight tone is, do you want to tone the highlights? This again only gets applied to a JPEG. If you shoot RAW, it does not get applied. So you could tone the highlights either positively or negatively. You could go through and you know, experiment with that if you shoot JPEG in camera. Shadow tone is exactly the same, except it's doing it for the shadows. Color, do you want to increase the color intensity or decrease the color intensity? And sharpness, do you want to add some sharpness or take some sharpness away from your JPEG image? So again, these are all just applied to the JPEGs that are shot in camera. If you shoot RAW, which I encourage you to do, these won't be applied to the RAW image. You could do all of that in post-processing. Noise reduction, do you want to add some noise reduction to your JPEG image? Again, you could do it there. Long exposure noise reduction. Now this will work for both JPEG and RAW. If you take a long exposure, the camera will then, after your initial exposure, let's say it's a 30-second exposure, the camera will then take a second 30-second exposure without exposing the sensor to any light. What it does when it does doing that is it's determining where the sensor has any hotspots or noise coming through, and then it uses that blank image to cancel out the noise in your real image. And typically I have that set to on, long exposure noise reduction. Just be aware that if you're doing a long exposure will take twice as long to finish. So a 30-second exposure will take over 60 seconds because the camera's going to take your first real exposure, then it's going to take a second exposure that isn't exposing the sensor to any light, and it's going to be a 30-second exposure as well, so that will be a 60-second total exposure. Lens modulation optimizer. Typically, if you stop a lens down too far, it will suffer from what's called diffraction. Usually a lens is at its sharpest when it's 2 to 4 stops up from wide open. If you go more than 4 stops closed down from wide open, the image will tend to distort because you're using such a small aperture. Lens modulation optimizer uses software in the camera to compensate for that, and it will give you a crisp, clear image even if you stop way down to like f/22, something like that. The color space, what color space do you want to work with? You have two choices, sRGB and Adobe RGB. I choose Adobe RGB. The best way to think of these is like a box of crayons. sRGB might be a box of 8 different color crayons, and Adobe RGB is a box of 12 different color crayons. So Adobe RGB is a little deeper palette of colors to work with, and that's what I choose to work with. Now, one thing I should say is most monitors only really could reproduce sRGB. Adobe RGB is if you're printing, a lot of printers will be able to produce a lot of the colors that are in the Adobe RGB color space. Pixel mapping. As your camera ages, some of the pixels tend to burn out in the sensor. So periodically you would run pixel mapping, and what it does is it basically determines which pixels are dead, and then it won't allow those pixels to work for a future exposure. And what it will do is it will look at all the surrounding pixels that are working, and it will extrapolate from those what chrominance and luminance values should be applied to that dead pixel. So it's good to run pixel mapping every now and then. Now, custom settings, I'm going to do a separate video on those because those are pretty much the same throughout the Fuji line, and I've done these menu videos for the Fujifilm X100T and the X-T1, and I'll be doing custom setting video all by itself, and it will cover all the cameras. So we're going to skip those, and that's all the image quality settings. The next one is the autofocus settings. Now, the first is the focus area, and this kind of goes hand in hand with the AF mode. When we go to AF mode, you can see we have three choices. We have single point, zone, and wide tracking. Right now I have mine set to single point. And when you go up to the focus area, you can see we have all these different points we could choose from. And you could use the buttons around the menu button to move these around. Now, if you want to move this back into its center spot, all you have to do is pick on or press the display back button. So if you have this way over here and you want to get it back to the center, just hit the display back button. Also, you could change the size of this focus point by turning the command dial on the back, and there's 5 different settings. The largest, then to the smallest, so you could just go through the 5 different settings. And the default setting is the 3rd largest, and to quickly get to that, you could just press in the command dial on the back of the camera and it will bring you to the default size for your focus point. Now, the smaller focus point will give you the most accurate focus, but your camera will take a bit longer to focus. The larger focus point or area will allow your camera usually to focus much quicker, but it may not be as accurate. And that's where the 3rd size up from smallest usually is the best choice. Now, we talked about the AF modes. The zone AF mode, if you choose that, you'll see your focus area is different and you can move your zone around. So whatever is inside of that box is what the camera is going to look to focus. This focus mode is best for moving subjects. If you're tracking a bird flying across the sky or someone riding a bicycle along a path, you would try to keep them in this large box. And again, you could change the size of this box with the command dial on the back. And you could see there's 3 different sizes. And the default size, you just press in on the command dial and you'll go down to the default size. Now the other mode is wide tracking. And when you do that, you can see the focus area is grayed out. The wide tracking uses pretty much the entire frame to try to track something moving through the scene. Typically, you would try to leave your camera still, and if you had someone riding a bike, let's say from left to right through the scene, the camera will keep what is moving, that person on the bike, in focus as they move left to right through the scene. And that, again, is good for certain situations. You might want to use that. Now, most often I use single point. Now, the number of focus points, you have 2 choices, 273 and 77, and I just switched it from 273 to 77. If you go to our focus points, you can see we have a lot less now. And if I go back to 273 and we go back to our focus area, you see how many more we have. So that's just all that is. And typically, the more focus points might give you a little more fine-tuning. You could focus more specifically where you want to focus. Less focus points, the camera will tend to focus a little quicker. Pre-AF, that means your camera is going to try to always be in focus while it's on. I keep that off because that will drain your battery. You could be walking with your camera at your side on a sling on your side, and if it's on, it would always be trying to focus. So that tends to drain the battery. So I keep mine off. AF illuminator, a little light comes on the front when you're trying to, or when the camera's trying to grab focus to help it focus. I keep mine off again because it will drain the battery a little. Face detection setting. This works really well if you're taking a picture, portrait. This will detect the person's face, and you could set it so it will detect their eye. So the camera will focus on your subject's eye. And it's so good, it really does work very well. that if your subject has their head tilted so one eye is closer to the camera than the other, it will focus on the closest eye, which you should do as a photographer, focus on your subject's closer eye. AF plus MF, that means that if you're in autofocus mode, you could manually focus at the same time. So I have that set to on. If you had that off, you wouldn't be able to manually focus. MF assist, that's the manual focus assist. I have mine set to peaking. So like, best way I could put it is in the old days of television, you used to get snowy pictures, and this kind of adds the snow look to the image. And the more snow the image has, the more in focus it is. And I have mine set to have really bright blue type of snow. So when I'm manually focusing, the more of that bright blue snow I could achieve when I manually focus, the more in focus my image is. Next is focus check. That's when you're manually focusing. As soon as you touch the focus dial, it will zoom into the focus area so you could get a better look at what you're focusing on, and you could turn that on and off. Interlock spot AE and the focus area, that means that wherever your focus point is, remember we're moving the focus point all around, wherever that is, that's what the camera is going to use for exposure. So if you have the focus point way up in the top right hand corner, it's going to look in that top right hand corner for exposure. And typically I like that on. Instant AF setting, this is when the little dial, you have a little three-way switch on the front of the camera. Manual, continuous, and single focus. That's what that stands for. When you have that on manual focus, when you press the shutter halfway in, your camera will not try to focus. But if you press the AF-L button on the back of the camera will focus. How do you want that button to behave? Do you want it to behave as a single focus mode or a continuous focus mode? Usually I like mine on continuous. So that's when I'm in manual focus mode and I use the back button to focus. Depth of field scale, that's through the viewfinder and on the back of the camera. Do you want it pixel based or a film format basis? I like mine pixel based. Release focus priority. I have both my AF-S and AF-C, that's single focus and continuous focus, set to release. That means that even if my subject is not in focus, when I press the shutter, the camera will take the picture. If you set it to focus, the camera will only take the picture when your subject is in perfect focus. So, my way, I usually have it on release. I will often take a blurry picture. If you have it set to focus, you'll never take a blurry picture, but you might miss a shot or two. So if you have a Bigfoot running across your backyard and you have it set to focus and you just grab that camera and try to grab a quick shot and it's not in perfect focus, your camera will not take the picture. If you have it on release, you will take a picture of the Bigfoot, although he or she might be a little blurry. So I prefer mine on release because you never know when you might run across a Bigfoot. Corrected AF frame. This is because the viewfinder is offset from the lens. And if you're shooting so that you're looking through the viewfinder, and the optical viewfinder I should add, that this will correct the frame so that you're focusing on the correct spot. It's going to show you where you're focusing. Because the viewfinder is offset, you're going to be suffering from what they call parallax distortion. You're going to be looking at a different spot than the lens is actually looking at. So that's why you would like that on, so you could see exactly what you're focusing on when you use the optical viewfinder. So that's everything in the AF-MF setting. Now we'll go to the shooting setting. Now we have a self-timer. You could do it for 2 seconds or 10 seconds. If you're shooting macros and you don't have a cable release, A 2-second would be nice. You could press the shutter, and then any vibration you induced in the camera will hopefully settle down within 2 seconds. Then the camera will take the picture. Or if you want to be extra careful, you could set it to 10 seconds. Or if you want to press the shutter and get in the shot, you'd set it to 10 seconds. Interval timer shooting. This you could set all different settings for how long it will take images for, how many images it will take, and how long between the images. So this is great if you're shooting star trails and things like that. Film simulation bracket. Now this again is only for JPEGs. You could actually set a bracket of different film simulation modes. So you'll take one picture, in this case, in standard mode, one in Velvia mode, and one in Astia mode. And you could change all these. So you might want to take one in black and white mode, one in Velvia mode, and one in Astia mode, or something like that. But again, this is only applicable to JPEGs. If you're shooting raw brackets, it won't be applicable. Photometry, this is how it determines exposure. The first is multi. What it does, it just looks at the scene and it tries to determine where in the scene it should determine what your exposure settings should be. The next is center weighted. It uses the entire frame, the entire scene, but it adds more bias towards the center of the frame. Spot means wherever you have your focus point, that's the way we had it set up. Remember when we were locking the exposure with the focus point. Wherever the focus point is, that's where it's going to look for exposure, and that's the way I have mine set up. And average means it looks at the entire frame and just averages it out and gives you an average exposure reading. I prefer spot. Shutter type, you could choose the electronic or mechanical shutter. There's different advantages of either. With the electronic shutter, you could get some very, very fast shutter speeds. But if anything is moving through the frame, or spinning, a wheel spinning, or a fan spinning, let's say, or someone just even running through, even walking through the frame, they'll be distorted if you use an electronic shutter. The mechanical shutter you would need if you're using a flash, or just if something's moving through the frame, you would prefer the mechanical shutter. Now, the IS mode right now is off because I don't have a lens on this camera right at the moment that has image stabilization. If you do have a lens on the camera that has image stabilization, you could actually turn image stabilization on and off through the menu system, as well as the switch on the lens. So that is why that's grayed out. I have a 35mm lens on here that does not have image stabilization, so that's grayed out. The next is the ISO auto setting. There's different settings, 3 different auto ISOs you could set the camera up with if you want to use auto ISO. Typically I will use the extremes of the default ISOs that are available in the camera. In this case, I usually would use, let's say, lowest of 200, and I'd use the highest of 12,800, and I don't want my shutter speed to go lower than 1/125th of a second. So what this means is when you're in auto ISO 1, your camera, when it looks at the scene, if it's too dark and your shutter speed is going to drop below 1/125th of a second, it will increase your ISO up to 12,800 in order to take the picture with a shutter speed at or faster than 1/125th of a second. So auto ISO comes in handy in a lot of situations. The next is mount adapter setting. This is when you're using a non-Fuji lens on the camera. You're going to tell it what mount adapter you're using, and you could come in here and it doesn't matter because I'm using a Fuji lens. Now, wireless communication I covered in previous videos. You could look for those. They're pretty much the same for all Fuji cameras, and I talked about the Instax printer. I covered it in that video, and I showed how you set it up on the Fujifilm X-T1. So you can check that out for wireless setting. Okay, next is a small menu for different flash settings. We have flash mode, you have forced flash, slow synchro, second curtain sync, commander mode, and suppress flash. Mostly you'd like that on forced flash, meaning if your flash is attached, it's going to go off. If you don't want it to go off, but you want to keep it on the camera, you'd have it on suppress flashed. Now, a commander mode is when this camera and the flash that is attached to it can command other flashes to turn on and off, or to flash, and what their power is and things like that. And that you would really have to look through the flash instructions that you have and the Fujifilm owner's manual, because to set that up properly for the different types of flash and whatnot that you'd be using. Slow synchro and second curtain sync are really handy for different situations. Again, I would refer you back to the Fujifilm manual. Gives you a better explanation of what those do. Typically, if you're using a very, very slow shutter speed, you have to time the flash in a different part of that shutter speed. You would use slow synchro. Second curtain sync, if you have something moving through the frame and you're using existing light and you just want to add a flash to freeze that person in spot, then you would use second curtain sync. And typically you don't want the flash to go off at the beginning of the exposure because it will freeze them. Then you'll have blur afterwards and it doesn't look natural. You would prefer that the flash come later. So you're using existing light, they're moving through the scene, let's say on a motorcycle, and they're going to be blurred at the beginning. Then the flash goes off at the end of the exposure, and they their image will be more solid and frozen at the end of their run across the scene. So it looks more natural, and that's where you would use something like that. Flash compensation, do you want to add some compensation, positive or negative? You could do that there. Red eye removal, if you're shooting portrait, you might want to have that on. And that's the 3 settings in the flash setting menu. Next we have movie settings. Again, very short. I keep my movie settings at the maximum quality, which is 1080p at 60 frames. You could change that to lesser quality if you so choose. Of course, the better quality you use, the more space it will take up on your SD card and your computer. Mic level adjustment, you could come in here and custom adjust your microphone so you're not clipping or it's not too quiet. Mic remote release. On the side of the camera there is one 2.5 millimeter input. You could use that as a microphone input or as a remote release. So if you're shooting macros and you have a remote, it would plug in there, and you would come to this part of the menu and you would switch that to remote. So you're shooting macros, when you press the remote, the camera will take the exposure. If you're using this for movies and you have a microphone, you would put that on microphone, and that 2.5 millimeter jack on the side of the camera will then be used for a microphone. Now, one thing I want to caution you is the 2.5 millimeter jack really isn't a standard size, so that if you do buy a small microphone to plug into this, typically it will be at 3.5 millimeters, maybe even a 1/4 inch. And you'll have to buy an adapter that will adapt either the 3.5 millimeter to 2.5 millimeter or a 1/4 inch to 2.5 millimeters, so just be aware of that. The next we have just set up for the camera. We have the user settings, so we could, we could format the memory cards here. So we have 2 different memory cards in here, and we could format them in slot 1, slot 2. We could set the date and time difference if we're on a trip and you're from, let's say, the East Coast of the United States and you're traveling to the West Coast of the United States. There's a 3-hour time difference. You could set it there so that the camera will record the correct capture time for your images. Language, that's standard. My menu settings are these different settings for your own menu, which is way down here at the bottom. You can see it's grayed out. Let me go back to that, I'm sorry. You can see right here it's grayed out because I don't have any settings in the My Menu setting, but you could do that so it's very easy. Things that you access quite often, you could put there and you could get to them a lot easier usually than drilling down through all these different menus. Sensor cleaning, you should run that once in a while to just clean your sensor. Reset will reset the camera, the shooting menu to all its default settings, and the setup menu to all its different default settings. Autofocus beep volume, so when you're using single focus mode and you're focusing on a subject, the camera will beep when it's in focus. How loud do you want it? Self-timer beep, so when you're running the self-timer, how long is it going to beep until it takes the image? So for 10 seconds it beeps until you get in the shot, let's say, and it takes the image. How loud do you want that? The typical operation volume, just how, when you press buttons and do different things to the camera, it makes noises. How loud do you want it? I have mine off. The shutter volume, when you, especially when you use electronic shutter, you could have the shutter make a noise, and how loud do you want it? And what sound do you want it? There's different sounds available. You could go through and whichever one is most appealing to you. The playback volume is when you're playing back a movie you recorded. How loud do you want the playback to be? Now we have the different screen settings. Now these are for both the electronic viewfinder and the LCD. So you could change the electronic viewfinder brightness. I have mine set to auto, so it kind of looks at the room light you're in or the outdoor light you're in and will automatically adjust brightness. Do you want to adjust the color of your EVF, make it more colorful or less colorful, for lack of a better way to put it? The actual brightness of the LCD screen on the back, is it too bright, not bright enough? You could adjust it there, and the color. Does it look washed out? You want more color added to it, you could add it there. Image display, I have set that to off. That's often called chimping. So you could have that on, and as soon as you take a picture, it will display the picture on the back LCD. I have mine off because it saves battery, and if I want to look at the image, I can manually do it. If you have that on, it will drain your battery a little quicker usually. EVF auto rotate displays, so when you're looking through the viewfinder and you turn your camera to a vertical orientation, will it rotate? I have mine set to on. Preview exposure in manual mode. Now this is as you're looking at the image. If you have the settings on your camera set, let's say you're in a very dark room and you have your camera set to 10 seconds, typically a 10-second exposure, and you have your aperture wide open and you have your ISO very high. Typically with a lot of cameras, especially DSLRs, if you're in that very dark room, when you look through your viewfinder or through the scene on the back LCD, it's going to be very dark. You won't be able to see anything. If you have it set to preview exposure and white balance, what that means is that it's going to give you an idea of how bright your image will be. So you're actually using a very slow shutter speed, very high ISO. So you're going to expose this very dark scene properly. It'll allow you to see it, and then you'll be able to focus. Now, the disadvantage of this is if you're using a flash, you won't really know because you're using a flash. So you might want to set that off. But in this case, I have it to preview the exposure and the white balance. You could have it set to preview the white balance. So remember that, you could come through. Review picture effect. Now these are these different picture effects you could do with the camera. You get it if you set it on to like toy camera or one of these different picture effects, it'll give you a preview of what that picture effect looks like in the EVF and through the LCD on the back. Framing guidelines, I like mine set to the grid 9, that's the rule of thirds. So when you look at the back LCD or through the viewfinder, you're going to see a very light grid, and that helps you frame a scene. You could use a 24 grid, or you could use an HD framing, and that would come in handy if you're making movies with the camera. Auto rotate on playback, so when you're playing back the image and you shot a vertical, does it automatically rotate it so you could see it properly? And I have mine set to on. Focus scale units, since I'm in the United States and I was brought up in the imperial group of measurements, I have mine set to feet. You may prefer yours to be metric and use meter. Okay guys, I must apologize. Right in the middle of my presentation, my camcorder battery died and I didn't have another charged battery. So I had to take the time to charge a battery, and we're actually in my other studio right now, so I apologize if everything looks slightly different. We left off with focus scale units, and we're going to go to the display custom settings. And this is actually what you'll see through your optical viewfinder and or your electronic viewfinder / LCD display. And if you look at the EVF / LCD first, you'll see that we have all these different things that will display on the back LCD or through the electronic viewfinder. What I have checked is what I like to display. I like the framing guidelines and the electronic level to be showing. I like the focus frame showing. I do not care for the AF distance indicator. I do like my manual focus distance indicator to show, and the histogram I like to show. And you could toggle any of these off or on by pressing the menu OK button, and that will toggle each feature off or on. And again, you could do these for both the EVF / LCD and the optical viewfinder independently. So you could really customize the displays to show the information you want them to show. So that is everything from the user settings through the screen setup. Next we have the button dial settings. We have the focus lever setting. This is this toggle like joystick button right there. And you could have it so it's just on, so when I move it around, it's going to move the focus points around. You could have it to push to unlock, meaning if you accidentally press it, nothing will, or move it, nothing will happen. Before it will do anything, you have to press it in, and then it will operate properly. Or you could just turn it off completely. I like mine to be on. Now the quick menu are these quick menu settings, and I mentioned that we will be doing that in a separate video, so look for that in a separate video. The function button settings, now this camera has a lot of programmable function buttons, and you would do that here, and it's really straightforward. It shows you what button you'll be changing. So if I want to change the function button 3, I would just go through and I could change it, let's say, to AF mode like that, and that button now will operate the autofocus modes. So you could go through for each of the 6 function buttons and program them the way you like them. The command dials, right, default is the front command dial does the shutter speed, and the back command dial does the aperture. You could switch those around if you want and have, swap their functionality. ISO dial setting has an H setting. You could set the H setting for 25,600 or 51,200. I have mine set for 25,600. Shoot without lens, that means if your lens is not on, it will take a shot. If you're using an aftermarket lens that is the Fujifilm does not recognize, does not think it's attached to your camera, you would want to put that to on. That way you'd be able to take a picture with that lens. Focus ring I have set to clockwise. You could focus the opposite way if that's the way you're used to focusing, so you could change that. The AEL and AFL buttons, this button and this button, you could swap their operations around. So this one would be AFL and then that one would be AEL. I prefer to leave them the way they are. The AFL lock mode, the way I have it set is that when I hold it, it's holding in an exposure reading. When I let go, it lets go with that exposure reading. And the same thing with focus. You could set it up so it's like an on-off switch. So you could press the AE-L button and it will grab the exposure and lock it in, and it will stay locked in until you press it again. Same thing with the AFL button. So you could change the functionality of those buttons. The autofocus lock mode, you could have it so that when you press the AF button, it's only affecting focus, and that's the way I have it set up. Or you could have it so it's doing focus and exposure at the same time. I have it just doing focus. Now, aperture settings are grayed out because I do not have a lens on this camera that does not have an aperture ring. If you have a lens on the camera that does not have an aperture ring, you would change the settings there. Power management is the next section. I have it set to auto power off in 2 minutes. You could change that to 5 minutes or turn it off completely. Power manage I have set to high performance. It focuses a little quicker when you have it set to high performance, but it will use more battery. So if you only have one battery and you need to preserve battery power, you might want to switch it to economy. It will focus a little slower though. So those are your power management settings. Now, save data setup. This is just how it saves the images and things like that. Continuous frame numbers, or do you want to renew frame numbers? It will go up, I believe, to 999. Then it will start back at 1 again. Or you could just, that's with renew. With continuous, it will just keep going. Save original image. Now this is when you use the red eye removal that we talked about earlier. If you have that set to on and you're shooting JPEG, what it will do is it will remove any red in anyone's eyes, and you'll have one image, the image with the red removed from their eyes. If you prefer, you could set this function right here to on, and it will save that image that has the red removed from their eyes, but it will also save the original image with the red in their eyes. So you may want to have that on. Edit file name, this is just, you could distinguish how its prefix is for the file. The way it is when I shoot sRGB, which I really don't ever do, the beginning of my Fujifilm file for the image would be DSCF, and for Adobe RGB it would be DSF. So all my images, since I shoot Adobe RGB, begin with DSF. So it might be DSF 102.RAF. Card slot, this is how it works, the two SD cards that are in the camera. You could go sequential, so it'll use up all of card 1 and then start shooting onto card 2. You could use backup, where it's going to just put all the images on card 1 and back up the images to card 2. That's the way I usually have it set up. And there's RAW and JPEG. That way it will save all your RAW files to the first card and the JPEG images to the second card. And I prefer to use a backup. Switch slot. That is grayed out because I have it on backup. If it was on sequential, then I could switch the way it does it. Instead of going from card 1 to 2, it would go from card 2 to 1. So that's what that is. And we're done with the Save Data Settings section. Now the connection settings, I mentioned before that I covered this before in the Instax printer video. I showed it how to set it up with an XT1, and it's very much the same here. So you would just watch that video and you'll get all this information on the connection setting. Okay, that's it. That's the menu system on the Fujifilm XPro2. I hope that helps you. I know when you first get your camera, it's sometimes overwhelming. You have all these different functions and menu choices, and I hope that makes it a little clearer for you. I'd like to thank everyone that watches my videos. I truly do appreciate it. I'll talk to you guys soon.